Welcome to the second annual Glenn F. Knoll Lecture. My name is Ron Gilgenbach, and I'm chair of the Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences Department. It's my pleasure to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. David Kay, who will speak on the challenges and opportunities of changing energy geopolitics. This annual lecture series was made possible by a generous endowment from Gladys Knoll to commemorate the over 50-year career in education and research of the late Professor Emeritus, Chair, and Interim Dean Glenn F. Knoll. These lectures in the field pioneered by Professor Knoll will be an inspiration to future generations of students. I'm pleased that Gladys and her son Tom are attending this year's lecture. And I should also mention that the selection of this year's lecture was particularly meaningful since Dr. Kay was a colleague who knew and respected Professor Knoll. Dr. David Kay has had a long and distinguished career in nuclear security and non-proliferation. I won't read this whole bio here, but I would like to point out that the first time I saw Dr. Kay, I was actually watching CNN, and he was in a parking lot in Baghdad surrounded by Saddam Hussein's soldiers. And I just read that this lasted for 4 days. So I never dreamed it was that exciting to be a chief weapons inspector for the IAEA. And then in the early 2000s, he went back to Iraq to lead the activities of the 1,400-member Iraq Survey Group, which had a major impact, as shown here, in which he concluded that there had been no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq at the time of the war. And he reported that conclusion and resigned his position, and that decision immediately led to congressional hearings, the appointment of an independent commission to investigate the causes of the intelligence failure prior to the war. So Dr. Kay has also served in a number of official U.S. commissions and delegations and private advisory commissions. He holds degrees from the University of Texas at Austin and PhD degrees from Columbia University. He's the recipient of the IAEA Distinguished Service Award and the U.S. Secretary of State's commendation. Currently, Dr. Kay is a senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and concentrates on counterterrorism and weapons proliferation. He's also a frequent commentator in the media on proliferation and terrorism issues. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kay.
Ron, thank you. I'll tell you, introductions are one of the hazards of speaking. I was recently introduced by a friend, or I thought a friend, who introduced me as the nation's leading expert on intelligence failures, having participated in a number of them. And I said, I don't know, I hope that doesn't make it to my tombstone. And once, which was actually in many ways funnier and more relevant to an academic experience, in 1960, I have to think of when this was. It was 1978. Congress mandated that the U.S. Institute of Medicine conduct an evaluation of the millions of dollars going to Egypt's foreign assistance, to Egypt as foreign assistance in their health sector. About a week before they were due to leave, I got a call from the State Department, "We'd like you to go to Egypt." And I actually love Egypt. I've worked there a lot. So I said, well, great, why? Well, we're sending 12 doctors there, and they were really at the top of the profession. But none of them have worked in a developing country. None of them know Egypt. We'd sort of like to have adult supervision. And I said, well, fine, I'll go, but how are you going to describe me? Well, we thought we could describe you as an economist. And I said, okay, I can play that role. So we went, and the Egyptians have learned how to manage foreign advisors who come in to give them advice. We made the trip with a stop in Rome, arrived because it's an overnight flight at about 8 in the morning. And of course, the first thing you want to do at an overnight flight is, I want to shower, I want to change clothes, and no, immediately taken into a cancer operation, ovarian cancer, on an 18-year-old. I wasn't sure that's what I'd signed up for. So, I mean, that, and then following that with a big lunch. So we were strung out on a table, my Egyptian counterpart, one of them opposite me, and he said, Dr. K, what is your specialist? Expecting to hear, I think, cancer or whatever, coronary. I said, I'm an economist. He looked really shocked. And, you know, I'm sort of shocked about economists too. It's not exactly who I wanted my daughter to marry. But I didn't think it was that serious. And about 5 minutes later, the Minister of Health, who was sitting in the middle of the table, pounded the table and he said, Dr. K, I understand you're a communist. And, you know, that's a problem with a Texas accent as you get really tired. I said, no, I'm an economist. Oh, he didn't look much more pleased. And actually, as I was trying to think of how I was going to answer this, I remembered that they had just executed a large number of communists. And I said, we're going to have a real talk when I get home about how you assign legends of people who do things like this. But, you know, so introductions are really, but you did it well, Ron. I'm honored to be here. I'm very happy. First of all, it's a distinguished university. The program, a fascinating period today, and to many colleagues who devoted a large chunk of their time to me. I appreciate that a great deal. But I'm really honored because of Glenn. And let me tell you the story of how Glenn and I got thrown together. It's not what I think either of us would have expected. When I went to the International Atomic Energy Agency, I was put in charge of doing something that hadn't been done before, and that was trying to evaluate the impact of their technical assistance. Now, without going too deep in the weeds, the funding of technical assistance had to be at the same level as the funding of safeguards. So it was sort of ransom for the safeguard program. But it had reached a substantial amount. It turned out when I took over, it was running about $500 million a year, which, because of backlogs, meant in some years you were close to really serious money for international organizations. But if you ask what had been accomplished, you got a list of inputs. This many students have been sent to universities. We bought this many oscilloscopes, et cetera. You got inputs, and no one had any data about impacts. And so I said, look, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it the right way, and we're going to figure out what impacts. And the largest chunk had gone to an area called nuclear science labs, which had been sprinkled around the world. The program officers, who were very good, loved them because it was a formula you couldn't go wrong with. You had things that had to be built, you had equipment that had to be provided, you had students who had to be educated and sent to very good universities, and you know, that formed the foundation, and that was to be the seed of nuclear science in various countries. So I wanted to take the hardest case first and do it myself, and that was Africa. Clearly where less of an infrastructure, and no one really knew what the impact was going to be. But I knew I needed someone with me who was distinguished, known, and I kept asking people. I called any number of people over the US, and I kept getting this name, Glenn Knoll. He's a guy you want to take, written the definitive book on detection, and knows him. He's really good to work with. They really should have emphasized the latter, because I can tell you, what we discovered was not unexpected to me. We discovered people who had been sent by the IAEA to really good schools. There's a lot of good equipment that had gone in, but in many cases, in most cases, it hadn't quite gelled. Why? Because the local infrastructure wasn't prepared. A lot of it was because of what we do to graduate students. Graduate students actually work, and they work hard on advanced programs and projects. So when they go back, what do they want to do? They want to work on those same advanced topics. They don't want to regress to doing, and I'll probably offend someone here, nuclear safety or nuclear or health or a lot of other, or food safety or any of the other problems you could do. And so they were frustrated, they weren't doing as much, and they faced, let me emphasize the obstacles they faced. Inconsistent power supplies, almost always dirty power, equipment that broke down, but you know, this was pre-web, pre-Amazon. You couldn't pick up a phone and get a package. I mean, they didn't belong to Prime. I mean, today I order something from Amazon and it's almost there before I'm off my computer. None of those things could be solved. It would have been very easy to go in and criticize. The thing I will always remember Glenn for is how he went in and did the critical judgments, but did it in a way that no one felt it was critical. He would have people say, well, you know, I can't, and there were real problems of continuing research. You didn't have the web, you didn't have Snapchat, you didn't have any of the ways that we now communicate and keep in touch on scientific and other issues. He dealt with it in a human way. I mean, one of the common things which graduate students will love to hear, people came back from the US and Europe, France, Germany. They had a PhD. They thought they couldn't clean a lab. And you know, you'd walk into labs that did not have the standards that you expect and made it easy work. Well, you know, we can't hire cleaners. Glenn told him about how he cleaned labs and that it wasn't, you know, it wasn't always someone else doing it. You could do it, but he did it in a way that wasn't a criticism. He also suggested research topics. And of course, they all wanted to hear him give lectures. And he did it free. Oh, well, that wasn't part of what I was paying him for. He did it without a single complaint. He was, in my ideal, perfect colleague. And a serious regret I have is I didn't have the opportunity to work with him as closely as many of you had. I cannot think of a better person to have as a close colleague. Now, we were in Africa. We had some African experiences. The one that I remember the most, we were flying from East Africa to West Africa, about a 2.5-hour flight. About an hour and a half in, the pilot came on the intercom and said, we've got to drop below these clouds because I have to find out where we are. Glenn looked at me. I mean, look, this is pre-GPS days, pre-Google Maps. He looked at me and I looked at him. And so I thought the only thing I could do is start telling him horror stories of my flights on Aeroflot and in China. And this was China, not today, but China 20 years ago. And, you know, sort of defuse the situation. But I mean, he had some opening African experiences. And the other thing I think he brought back to the department, which must be still around, I think when we cleared customs, Glenn must have had 50 pounds of malachite. He brought carved elephants, carved anything. I mean, it was cheap, it was interesting, and he took to it. The enthusiasm and the way he did it. And consequently, after having done Africa, I said, I'll let some of my other staff go with him. They all came back deeply in love with him. I mean, they just loved working with him. And that, in my view, is, if you want to be remembered for something, sure, you'll be remembered for the technical work you are, but it's the lives you change, the interactions with your colleagues that make the most. And Glenn is a paragon of virtue in that regard in my case. So I'm particularly honored. I'm thankful for Gladys for doing this and for others for inviting me here. Now what I want to, that's right, I'm supposed to change slides. Let me see, maybe I will try the clicker because I do understand up and down arrows. Yeah. I want to talk about something that's not in my traditional lane that you might have expected. When I was deciding what I wanted to talk about today, I thought back to what Glenn was like. And one of the things I remember about him is he had a completely omnivorous, he was fascinated by everything. You could have a conversation with him on almost anything, and he knew pieces of information you didn't know. And I said, and there's, in some ways, we shared that experience of not wanting to be stovepiped into one thing. And I thought, well, maybe the best thing I can do is talk about a piece of work that I have recently, along with colleagues, and look, independent work is never independent, and nor should it be, with some colleagues. And let me explain the origin of this. I serve on something called the International Security Advisory Board, which is to give a group of mostly worthies and noteworthies, former Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor and all, to give advice to the State Department. Now, mostly what I think the State Department expected is they would ask us the hard questions and we would give them the equally hard answers. But we also do something else that I think they didn't expect, but I think is in many ways more valuable. It's one thing to have people, a customer, ask you what they want an answer to. It's often more valuable if you tell them what they should really be asking and really paying concern to. And so a certain number of our projects are actually self-generated within the board. In 2013, and this is in oil prices were then in the $70 range, not 100, but certainly not where they went. I became convinced that there were changes taking place in the energy market that had large structural geopolitical impacts that needed to be examined. The world was not what it once was. Now, it was perhaps easier for me because I was born in, grew up in Texas. I'm very much, or historically, very much from the oil patch. I actually have a residual oil lease, which has now been, because of being passed down, I think I have 1/8 of something. But I sort of grew up in that culture, and I was a little bit more attuned to changes that were taking place than I might otherwise have been. And so I said, look, we need to spend some time looking at what's going on here. The global energy market is changing. And it really has changed. It's changed in remarkably fast ways and far more than most people anticipate. In fact, if you go back and look at the estimates of where we're supposed to be now in terms of consumption, supply, patterns of trade, all of that, as late as the last year and the first 2 years of this century, 99 to 2002, 2003, none of it is what eventually turned out and developed. There were surprises, tremendous surprises. And so I'd like to take some time tonight talking a little bit about that, and I also want to leave time for questions about this because I think it's fascinating and we're only beginning to understand the impact. But remember Somerset Maugham's quote. This is one I've used often. In fact, it's partly age. I've discovered that when you brief senior officials who have no, except in Department of Defense, no use for PowerPoint slides and can't read more than a page or so without wanting to change the topic, that it's best sometimes if you can brief them in terms of a series of catchy quotes that catch their interest and they try to figure out what it means. For me, this is what the energy market means. If I knew what I knew and I was certain of what I knew, I would be wrong. So let me start with, let me get moving on to where I want to go. And you'll discover I may look at these slides and I may not in terms of what I want to talk about. But look, since the 1970s, the U.S. has had a simple paradigm of what is involved in energy. We viewed energy as scarce. We viewed it as us being vulnerable to energy shortages, energy supply disruptions, and we viewed energy sources as being insecure. And that's, for us today, is not true on any of that. But it still is very much the paradigm which has dominated U.S. policy making and thinking. Now, some of the reaction to that, some of that has had far greater impact than I think anyone really anticipated. Mandated mile per gallon standards for automobiles has had a huge impact on energy consumption in the United States. And fleet renewal is going to make it an even larger impact than it has been. Strategic oil reserves. One way, we came out of the 73 oil crisis, 73, 74 oil crisis, and the OECD countries decided we needed to find a buffer. Our strategic oil reserves, which involve pumping oil into salt domes, has turned out to be a very good moderator and relaxant when, in fact, crises started to emerge. Just the cooperation among the Western, i.e. International Energy Agency, and OECD states, in terms of the energy problems they face and think common solutions, has turned out to be a valuable part of building up relationships that we didn't have before. And finally, we learned to start to pay great attention to energy producers, particularly those in the Middle East. But the paradigm has really changed in a lot of fundamental ways. We've rearranged customers and countries paying, and whether you're talking about production, trade, or any of the major ones. And let me give you just a brief tour of how it looks different. North America now has a structural surplus in energy. And the Western Hemisphere as a whole is awfully close to having a structural surplus. This is a drastic change from just 20 years ago, and is bound to have an impact. Europe, Russia supplies 1/3 of the natural gas to all of Europe, and it's a lot higher actually in eastern Western Europe and in southern Western Europe than that. 90% of the Russian income from their sale of gas comes from Western Europe. That is a huge figure, and it works both ways in terms of its consequence. Between 2000 and 2010, 60% of all oil, U.S. oil, consumption was imported. 60%. As late as 2010, we were at that figure. Today, less than 30%. Think of the consequence of a change that large. Now, partly it was, and I'll say a few things about it later, it was a result of changes in fracking, which came about. And fracking itself is an interesting thing, particularly for a group of people like this, interested in technology, to look about. When did fracking first occur? The first patent in the US is 1865. And believe me, you would not have wanted to be around with that particular fracking technique. It was called an explosive torpedo, and it was liquid nitroglycerin dropped down at oil and water wells in Pennsylvania. The idea was the same: frack it, break apart, and you'll get more of the resource. They did change a year later to at least using solid nitroglycerin. I mean, the very thought of filling a metal tube with liquid nitroglycerin, and you sort of lose me at the filling stage, but then dropping it down a well and trying to figure out what point it's going to explode, and this was pre-computational science, is just amazing. The next patent was issued and experiments were done in 1947. A Texan came back from the war and decided, and these were strictly vertical wells, I mean, they were straight wells down, decided that, well, if you fill it with jelly gasoline, that's known as napalm, put a little dynamite in it, it might frack well. Well, it exploded well, but it didn't. It was lousy fracking, and so that was sort of. But there was. Then you get up to our current period, which is fracking, or what we call fracking, or the oil revolution in tight oil and shale gas, is a product of 3 different technologies: 3D geological imaging, the ability to understand in great detail geological structures underground. And that's a large part. Some of it has its origin in the Cold War, which had other uses. It's advanced the ability to get computational imaging done in a way that made sense. The second was in a revolution in horizontal drilling. Now, if you come from Texas, you're used to all oil wells not going straight down. This has been a source of war and conflict in Texas since the drilling of oil, because you would find people who, the neighbor had good oil and producing well, they would locate one right on the other side of the property line, and guess what? They had good oil too. Well, they may have drilled in the oil reserve on their side. More than likely, they slanted the well slightly and you penetrated a reserve on the other side. This is an idea that's actually, well, and if you look at the Iraq invasion in 1991 of Kuwait, they justified it by saying Kuwait had been drilling into their reserves and they refused to pay them. Horizontal drilling is something completely different. I mean, the idea that you can turn a drill underneath at several thousand feet often, and you can follow a strata of shell. In the Bakken, there is one that is 10,000, I think it's 10,000. The typical problem being an American, you have to be careful and pause as to whether you're remembering the figure in meters or feet. This one is 10,000 feet. It's roughly 2 miles horizontally and following a particular geological deposit, which is just an amazing technique. And then the final component was really finally understanding how to do hydraulic fracking, using hydraulic pressures, oil, chemicals, and a few mix of proprietary other substances to actually break apart the strata. It's made a revolution in the way that we get oil and gas, tight oil, shale gas in the U.S. And so that structure has started to change. We've also had changes in some not so favorable in the nuclear area. We've had changes in renewables. In fact, I'll say a few things about renewables. I'm actually optimistic. Nuclear power as such, and I want to say something more concrete about nuclear energy at the end of this talk. But essentially, in short form, 44% of all nuclear power stations under construction today are in Asia. China and India are the growth market for nuclear power. Well, let me say a few things about on the global energy investment climate, because that was one of the things that attracted me to this, and in fact, it continues to get my interest. Where did the fracking investment come from? It didn't come from the major integrated oil companies. It came from individual small companies doing what wildcatters have been doing in Texas since the beginning of drilling, convincing someone to lend them enough money so they could do something and promising that it would have almost immediate return on investment. And indeed, that is the secret of fracking, the economic secret of fracking. And it's changed the way global investment climate for energy. At oil prices, well, it depends on the oil price, how fast and how rapid the return of investment is, but it's a lot better than almost any other energy source out there. And what it has done, along with a series of other developments that has occurred, it's made energy investment, CapEx expenditures of the major oil companies, in other geological formations that look even better for traditional oil drilling, unwilling to undertake the investment. And it's also made them a lot pickier about where they do it. You would not today get a major oil company to invest under today's circumstances in countries like Libya, Algeria probably. I doubt if Nigeria would even under today's circumstances. And they're companies walking away from known oil deposits, known reserves, simply because you can be a lot pickier. We don't need it right now. Now there are others who are willing to play the risk game, although they too have become more cautious. The Chinese are the country that in seeking energy and a need for oil and natural gas have in fact invested in countries like Venezuela, have tried to play the Bolivian gas game, countries that you can't get majors to touch today. Let me say a few things about the U.S. before the U.S. before I go on. U.S. energy consumption is growing this last year at about, last year we have good data, which turns out to be about 2013, 0.8% a year. It's way down from historic lows. Our energy, we've become more efficient, we're using less, and quite frankly, the economy has changed. We are a country of services, software, technology, and no longer manufacturing. Now, the strange thing about this is occurring at exactly the time when, if energy was the key to industrial growth in the U.S., we would be in a boom period. If you look at natural gas prices, we pay the Chinese pay 2.4 times our price for BTU of natural gas. In Japan, it's a little bit higher. In some parts of Europe, it's between 4 and 5 times our price for energy. But the fact is, energy production, industrial production, is driven by prices and things other than just energy. But it is having an impact on relationships there. In the long term being, as far as I can see when I don't believe anything I see, you have to realize natural gas is fueling about 60% of all new energy generation being built. And that's not likely to change. It's the turnaround time for natural gas is a natural gas investment, putting a turbine back, is measured in maybe a year, maybe 18 months, but certainly no longer than that. For any other source, coal, you're still talking about a finite number of years. Nuclear, I don't know. And I'll give you my poster case for this. The British finally, last week, decided to go ahead with something called Hinkley Point C, which is, and here again for the American audience, is called the Evolutionary Pressurized Reactor, or it's now actually just called EPR. In Europe, it was called the European Pressurized Reactor, a new generation of French-built or French-designed reactors. There are 2 being built in China, 1 in France, and 1 in Finland. They're all horribly behind schedule, with some with really serious redesign problems required. This tripartite agreement committed the partners to a $23.4 billion, I think, was the final size negotiated, billion for the construction of 2 reactors, about 3.2. Each one's about 1.8 mega in size. The project started in 2008. Construction is supposed to begin sometime in 2017. Who knows when the end point is going to be. But more importantly is the price that had to be struck to make this deal work. Britain agreed to pay the partners for 30 years a price per kilowatt hour that is exactly double the current wholesale price for of electricity in the UK. That's not an economic decision. In the UK, it's led by a decision to go ahead and try to decarbonize the economy. Really good motivation. But the price for doing it is huge. And it's it's the only case I know of in which the labor union of the company that is building the largest portion of the reactor, that's EDF in France, voted against doing it because they thought the company was taking a risk that would cost them, force them into bankruptcy. And they may be right, although it's really hard to force a company into bankruptcy in France. the government has a way of rescuing, particularly the crown jewels of the economy. So, I mean, that is sort of the picture around. Now, let me do a quick tour of the other regions and how they are changing. Like I say, North America is pretty solid. Canada is it's wrong to talk in energy terms about Canada than the U.S. because our energy industries and grids and all are so tightly woven. Canada is a major importer to the United States of oil and of electricity from the Quebec hydro projects. Canada is building, they've committed to building LNG plants on the West Coast to supply the Chinese market. And so that's Canada is rich in energy. It's not the least expensive energy. The oil is heavy oil coming from the oil sands, but it's a huge deposit. And so if you've got an insatiable market out there, it will work for it. Now, as you move to Europe, it's a picture that only has glimmers of light and encouragement. There are fracking deposits available in Poland and in the UK, and here again is where politics and structure and culture plays a role. You realize the US is the only major country in the world in which the government does not own the resources that lie underneath land. In every other country, oil, mineral, or whatever deposits are underground are not the landowner's property. They're the property of the state. And so in terms of doing fracking, you're talking about disrupting a countryside for which the individual owner will get absolutely no benefit and will in fact suffer a certain degree of disruption from it. And so it's been very, very slow to move ahead, and I don't think I'm very pessimistic about Poland, maybe, but because they would like to free themselves of total dependence on Russia for gas. The UK, not at all. The only bright side in Europe, well, it's really two bright sides. Energy efficiency has improved massively. Now, in looking at the data, you have to be careful and try to disentangle two things occurring. A financial crisis is really good for suppressing energy use. You know, if you're not producing, you're not using. And 2008 on, you get a certain decrease, and it's true in the US as well, although less noted than in Europe, of decline in energy use simply because you're going through an economic recession. But they have actually improved energy efficiency. And that's a bright sign, and in fact, if you look at the entire OECD world, which includes us, Europeans, Japanese, energy is in decline in terms of demand. It's slow, it's not sharp, but it's certainly not rising the way it once was. The one bright story in Europe is a far greater use of renewables than we have. Wind turbines particularly, and solar. Not because they're producing a huge amounts, but they're driving production expertise and technology to learn how to do it better. And you know, I know I'm talking to the choir here, but policymakers don't often understand this when you tell them. Do not expect full-blown technology to grow, workable technology, to grow in first deployment. It really is learning by doing, by probing the boundaries and making it, and it's really great when you can in fact do it, produce real things, and don't expect it to come out first. But you know, there's this recent period in Germany, because they had really great wind, and unlike a lot of German weather, they had a lot of sun, in which they were paying people to use electricity. It was like negative interest rates, because, and there's something else I want to say something about, there was no way to store it. So it was pumping it out and using it. So Western Europe is that way. Now, going to the Middle East. As oil fell through the bottom, fell from 100 to into the 70s, and in the 60s, and I didn't have a chance today to look at what Brent closed at. When I looked in the morning when I got up, it was at $47 and change, the Brent crude, which is the world standard price, except it's more widely traded than West Texas oil, which is always somewhere, but well, it used to be more of a difference, but now it's really narrowed to, it's 50 to 75 cents, occasionally $1 difference. It made a huge difference for those countries that are selling and producing and selling oil. And let me give you my classic case of the country that is going through great pain right now, and that's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a structural deficit that the IMF has now put at about $21.3 billion and said the only way the Saudis currently can get out of that is if oil prices move up to $67 a barrel. The chance of $67 a barrel oil in the immediate period just isn't there because what? As oil becomes more expensive, what happens to shale gas and oil? It becomes much more profitable to either uncap wells that were not produced and not connected, or to go ahead and drill other ones. And you've got a real incentive in the shale gas industry is because well productivity drops at what is, for me, is an amazing race. Productivity drops in the first 6 hours, starts to drop. It's a slow decline. And the reason is technical once you think about it. When you're fracking, you're breaking apart rocks so oil can flow in. When you take the pressure off, what does nature do? Nature closes back in, and so the fracture closes back in. Now, there are technical ways, some of them are proprietary as to the mix that a fracker will use in order to keep the fraction open as long as possible. But most oil wells within 12 to 18 months turn out to be much less profitable. But that's not a problem. We'll drill another one because the reserve is so extensive that it's just a matter of punching another hole and running a horizontal drill and then carrying out the fracking again. But so if you're an oil producer that largely depends on oil or gas, and you look at higher prices, which you really want, and you think, those Americans the shale gas producers are going to do what they're going to do. And so it's a really uneasy, and more importantly, for the purpose of what I was looking at, the potential destabilization of countries is really huge. I mean, if you take Algeria, who in the 1990s went through a horrible civil war, which was ended as most civil wars are, more by exhaustion than by agreement on what the future should be. Algeria's revenue from oil and gas is now 50% less than it was at the beginning of this decade. In other words, in 6 years, their oil revenue has fallen by 50%. And that's their principal export. That is what sustains the country. Iran is a little better off. The IMF estimate was they would close their much smaller structural deficit. It's only about 2.3% of their GMP. They would close it at oil prices between $60 and $63. Still not something that's going to happen overnight. Other states, oil producers, are facing it. Russia is one that is facing it. Now, the Russian response to it has been, which is a wise one, is to try to open new markets that are hungry where you might be able to get a price premium, and that means China, and that's not really, I wouldn't bet on getting a price premium in China, but it's an option. They've opened new reserves, and the new reserves are large. Russia today, this last month, started producing at 11.3 million barrels a day. Now that's top peak for Saudi. That's a lot of oil to be pushing through the system. But it's because of the hunger for the money. It's an economy that when oil prices were high, they made the fatal mistake. They didn't invest it in modernizing the economy and the industrial infrastructure. The Saudis right now are facing that and trying to do something different. But the pressure on all of these countries is going to increase if oil prices remain low. Now, go to the area where it's economic growth and energy consumption is going up, and it looks like the world we used to imagine that we were in Europe and the United States, and that's Asia. It's principally two countries in Asia. It's China, and the country that gets far less attention in the US than it should is India. Chinese energy consumption, and here again, you've got to separate out what is happening because of reduction, because of demand, but also the Chinese are making a major commitment to change their economy more from just gross industrial production into higher end and to service. And that uses, as we all know, less energy. India is the opposite story. In India, you have 250 million people who have no access to electricity. What does that tell you in terms of demand? And energy growth, demand for energy in India is actually growing much faster than it is in China. And so the energy story of certainly the next couple of decades is going to be written in Asia, and it's going to be written principally in China and in China and India. Production in Asia, Japan and Korea have essentially no domestic energy resources. There was coal in Japan. It's not economical. It's not clear how long it's been economical. In the rest of Asia, the major production story, and it's a golden one, is Australia. Australia is among the world's largest exporters of uranium, coal, and gas. A triple win in terms of Australian exports. And they mostly flow to Asia, and to a large extent they flow, India does get an increasing amount, but China gets it. And the real cost on gas is there. If you don't have a pipeline, you've got to liquefy it, and that's expensive. It's expensive in transportation costs and expensive in both liquefying it and then cooling it, warming it up, so it's a gas again. But that's the story of what it looks like there. But I'd like to move. Let me see if I can get. Let me just hit very briefly, because I know we're pressing up against time. Energy independence. Since Jimmy Carter was president and the oil crisis of '73, every elected U.S. president has had a program to make us independent of energy. It's a myth. Like most myths, it has a grain of truth in it, but it also has a ton of untruths and impossibility in it. The energy market is a global phenomenon. We will pay global prices, and we can't unless you're going to build one hell of a big wall, and not just on one border, but around, isolating us from the rest of the world. You're going to be stuck as being a member of the world. And that means what happens in the rest of the world on energy is relevant to you. Plus, we've got political and economic ties. I've spent too much of my life in the Middle East explaining to Middle East politicians who say, you only are here as an American, and you only pretend to love us because you really love our oil. Now, I didn't think that was true. It was awfully hard, though, with the rhetoric of some of American politicians to explain and say with a straight face that that's not true, but it isn't. We have enduring interest with regard to the Middle East and what happens there, because we're interested in what happens to Japan. We're interested in what happens to Korea. We're interested in what happens to India and China. So we can't isolate ourselves and think we're independent, the rest of the world can go its own way, and we can disengage. Not going to happen, shouldn't happen, and my hope is that we'll finally elect a president who will not claim that he's got a program for energy independence. We may elect a president who proclaims that for the wrong reason, and so I could end up with my wish not what it was. Let me talk very quickly about what I think is the most serious challenge the national security challenge that is being posed by energy. And it has nothing to do with embargoes. It has nothing to do with even instability. It has a lot to do with the global climate change. Believe me, folks, it's real. It's not a myth. It's not a hoax that the Chinese created. It is real and it's happening, and the data is solid. And it really is more than the flooding of the coastal marsh area, the coastal tide, although I live 3.5 miles from one coast, and I happen to live in the county on the highest piece of land in Sussex County, Delaware. Height, 11 feet above sea level, so it's not very high. But look, it's not that. It is the extinction of some countries, and this is particularly true of island nations in Asia. It has a lot to do with even with disease. One of my more recent projects has been to how we respond to global disease, pandemic threats, and other global diseases. A lot of those have their origin in climate change. Why do you think we're worried about Zika virus in New York State? I mean, normally in the old days, that mosquito wouldn't come even if you gave it a full expense trip with guaranteed blood meals, would come nowhere close to New York State. It's just the wrong climate. You know, you go out, and Delaware is a state that is a barbell in terms of the economy. One is tourism, increasingly people who retire there, but the other barbell is agriculture. You spend any time in a farmer's market talking about farmers, about how their crops are changing, when they plant, when they harvest, the disease threats they're facing. It's real, and it's climate change, and we're going to have to face it. It's really the wild card I see in shaping energy futures. And let me tell you, I mean, I'm often surprised to hear discussion, mostly from politicians, but not entirely, who say, well, the forecast could be wrong. It might not be that bad, so we can delay. Listen, if you've ever dealt with a model, the model can be almost as certainly can be wrong, but it can be wrong on both sides. We could face a more rapid change in climate, deterioration of climate. I would say, given the quality of the models and the data that goes into the models, it's probably about 50% whether it will be slower than or faster than. We're clearly facing more megastorms and instability in regions around the world. And it's more than a U.S. problem. In many ways, we have built in an amazing amount of resilience. That's not true of a lot of countries around the world. And so major changes in climate, which affect either crop production or affect disease, insect attacks, what have you, are likely to be a dominant threat that becomes a national security threat in the decades ahead. And I think it's coming faster rather than later. Let me very quickly run through challenges and opportunities. You know, as an analyst, I was sort of trained that in the analyst part of my life is your responsibility every day when you come into whatever office you have is to ask the ritual question: how is today different than all other days? You're looking for variation and you're looking for change. So when I started this project, I said one thing we wanted to do, we need to learn where the surprises are. They could be good, they could be bad. In disruptive technologies, believe me, at the top of my list is energy storage. And I really mean more than batteries. I think there probably is, laws of physics, at some point a density issue with regard to how you can pack batteries. I'm waiting for the bright young graduate student who comes out and figures out how to store energy that doesn't involve pumping water up a mountain and letting it come back down again, or building a bigger and better battery, although I'm certainly not against better batteries. I can't even remember sure I can say it. And we need it, and that will be part of it. But the largest disruptive technology would be a really innovative, a cost-effective way to do energy storage. It would impact everything from, everyone immediately thinks, it would make renewables better. It's true. Think of what it would do to nuclear power. Talk to any nuclear power operator and ask him, would you rather run as a base load facility or would you really like to do follow load? I've yet to find anyone who wants to do follow load because of the engineering stresses on the reactor and on the fuel elements and all the complications that flow it. If you had effective, cost-effective, and technically effective energy storage, the cost argument for baseline nuclear power would be a lot stronger than it is today. Sure, cheaper and better, more effective renewables. They're a lot better than I thought they would be at this point. There's a lot of work going on, so I'm reasonably confident that disruptive technology is going to happen. Transportation, in Michigan, is probably not a bad place to talk about it. It really is more than hybrids, and it's more than miles per gallon energy efficient standards. We are also seeing in US and Western Europe a societal cultural change. If you look at polling data of the millennial generation in the US and you look at people have asked very detailed questions about their attitudes towards automobiles and transportation that costs, they couldn't care less about automobiles. Automobiles were central to my independence and freedom as a teenager. I mean, for me, they were how you got out of the thumb and control of your parents. They represented a transition to adulthood. There was a romance about automobiles. That is gone from the millennial generation in the United States and Europe. I mean, I remember I have a grandson who is off in college, is a sophomore this year. He got a Kia in high school. And I remember I asked him, what's the horsepower of that? He had not a clue. Now, I can't imagine, I mean, as a teenager, I pored over, well, things that don't exist, carburetors. Ask him what a carburetor is. You know, and you get blank look. It's like asking, how do you calculate with a slide rule? Don't do that one, I've done it. It's something that does not translate. But transportation is changing both for technical reasons. I do think renewables make a huge difference in transport. I think Uber makes a difference. Ride sharing is a major future, particularly in urban areas. But we've lost the romance of the American road. So I think that is something that is going to make a difference. Oil and gas extraction, I don't think we're anywhere close to the end of the fracking revolution. One of the largest fracking opportunities today happens to be in China. It also happens to be in a region of China that doesn't have any water. So it's very expensive to do. Well, look, there's work being done that makes fracking a lot less dependent on water, a lot less dependent on liquids, a lot more efficient use of the liquids it's dependent on is a better way of saying it. I think those extraction techniques will go ahead. The Chinese and the Indians are buying into US fracking operations, learning the technology and going back and trying to do the development work. As oil prices fell, we actually had our frackers get smarter about how to frack. And so, I mean, I think there are, and there probably are other. A great example, although it's not a great economic example, of what are called pre-salt deposits. When we had one continental mass before plate tectonics broke us apart, large oil deposits formed at the edge of what we now know as continental shelves. They're called pre-salt because they're under salt deposits. The problem is they're under 2,000 to 3,000 meters of water, 2,000 meters of hard rock, and 2,000 meters of salt to get to it. You want to think of an engineering problem that's really tough to how to do that economically? The two major deposits that are known, one is off the coast of Angola, and there are 4 wells, I think, right now exploring it. They are producing oil. It's not economical because you got to figure out how you do it. The other is Brazil. And here's how projects forecasts can go wrong. At the beginning of this century, and that's not that long ago, 16 years ago, the prediction was that by the time we got to the latter part of this decade, Brazil would be a major exporter because of the pre-salt deposits. They screwed it up. It was corruption. It was It was a lousy energy investment offer they made to the majors, so they got none of the majors playing into it, and everyone involved is now either in jail or about to be in jail in Brazil. They will figure it out, and it will come online, and so that is going to be a major. I'm less optimistic and less certain about the time frame. And finally, carbon sequestration. If you can figure a way to sequester carbon and do it effectively and do it in a way that has no other environmental side effects, that is a very disruptive technology. I'm actually optimistic. I think, in fact, on that. I think there is some very good work being done, and we may break that one. What it will do, though, is before people get too excited about it, it may give us some time. It doesn't really break the climate change of intensive energy and use and environment. It does will buy some time. Geopolitical developments. Where are the surprises there in energy? Well, certainly one is another global energy economic crisis. It's horrible to say, but the most effective way to drive energy demand down is to have a major recession or depression. I don't advocate it, but it certainly would. It is a surprise. It would affect the energy world. We have built more resilience, we meaning the United States, into the energy market than most people thought 10, 15 years ago was possible. We've had the issue of Nigeria oil being temporarily disrupted because of terrorism, Libya because of Gaddafi's fall, Algeria because of civil war and disruption, Iran taken off the market because of sanctions, Iraq, which is back at really full production right now, but the threat of ISIS, and the market has not been really major affected by it. But there are some things that you could pull out that would be really hard in the short term to compensate for. The fall of the House of Saud in Saudi would be a really tough thing to compensate for. General increase in instability, not a major government change, but instability, political disputes that traumatize, and Algeria in many ways is the classic case for this. It's got a president who is awfully close to comatose. The government is being run by a triumvirate of the security services, the military, and the oligarchs, essentially. And so no decisions are being made. And a period of instability which low oil prices could produce in a series of energy producers would be a serious surprise. Global choke points. Look, when 80% of the world's coal that is traded goes to Asia. Oil, same. Gas, even more actually in terms of LNG percent goes to Asia. You've got to worry about two major choke points. The Straits of Hormuz is being one, and the Malaccan Straits in Asia being the other. So you do have to worry insecurity. And let me take down the temperature on one thing that is causing concern. Chinese development along the islands of South China Sea. Look, if the roles were reversed, we were as dependent on energy that flows through that single choke point. Do you think we would be concerned about the security of that? And I'm not justifying everything the Chinese have done in the way they've done it. The Chinese have a legitimate concern about the security of their transport routes, given the vulnerability they are to oil supplies. Now, some countries did it differently. If you look at Japan, how they handled theirs, they tried. It didn't work so well after reactor disaster, Fukushima, but that's there. Okay, the other three that could cause it that I worry about, I've mentioned one, rapid accelerating climate change is a really disruptive geopolitical development. Collapse of U.S. leadership, which I used to think I wouldn't have to worry about. I worry seriously about it. If we try to retreat from the world, the shocks that could, second and third order effects of that, I don't think anyone has thought through, and that includes me. And then you're vulnerable to a disaster in specific energy areas. Everyone who's lived through Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima understands that it can, I mean, it essentially took out the Japanese nuclear industry, literally almost overnight. And they're having a very hard time bringing it back online. And some of it is for good reason. There were Japanese, I spent about 2 years of my life, a large part with Japanese energy producers. There were things they were doing that I thought, and a lot of other people in the nuclear industry thought was not the right thing. I mean, you build a fast breeder reactor right on a clearly understood fault line. You put your reprocessing facility in it. I mean, there are things that are there, so they were particularly vulnerable. I worry about an LNG accident at an LNG port facility. A liquid natural gas facility, in terms of explosive power, is a nice-sized nuclear weapon if it explodes. If you had one go off, what would happen to every other community that has an LNG facility near it? The political demand to close it down, until you understand, would be probably unstoppable. And for countries like China, that is a huge disruption that would have to be calculated. Now, finally, because I promised, although I've gone way beyond what I promised, I want to say a few things about nuclear power, but I'll try to concentrate this on only a few words. Why would you want it? Well, look, it's the best with low emission greenhouse gas way to produce electricity. I mean, I would love to have it. Base load, it's superb. National security, and this I mean, look, the reason the Japanese after '73 went so big on nukes is because it doesn't cost very much to stockpile a couple of years of fuel. I mean, it's the cost of a nuclear power plant is all in building the nuclear power plant. It's not in your fuel cost. It's 2% usually of the cost of operating a nuclear power is related to fuel. And right now, we happen to be sitting in a period in which uranium prices are at an all-time historic low. It's probably even got cheaper. Why not? I've already said something about capital intensity, very long return on investment. The economic advantage in a market like ours, unless you're in a regulated producing to market where you can actually work the numbers, but in an unrestricted market, gas beats nuclear every which way, and that's not going to change. Baseload. In most of Western Europe and in the United States, we've satisfied our baseload demands. The plants are in place, they have a good lifetime left, and with energy demand decreasing in both areas, Western Europe and ourselves, there's not a huge market for our new baseload. Waste disposal. In the United States, the Department of Energy has discovered how to do final disposal of dollars. They've not quite discovered how to do final disposal of waste, despite the fact that every energy consumer where there's a nuclear reactor has been paying in to a fund to do exactly that. So that's got to be worked. And we'll always be one accident away. If you're going to, where are they going to be? They're mostly going to be in China and India. That's where the market is. And increasingly, as this proceeds, if we don't build new plants, the expertise is going to be in China and India, where it appropriately should be. They're the only people building plants. I wish if we were going to walk away and accept that solution, we'd do it as a result of rational debate and discussion. We're not doing it as a result of that. And finally, and we don't have time much more to say, are there unicorns out there? I get frequent calls particularly from foundations, who have people come in with new ideas for nuclear reactor design, and they want to ask me, are they proliferation proof? Which is sort of a funny concept, but anyway. And they're mostly, quite frankly, not all that new ideas. Thorium cycle has been something the Indians, because they have large thorium deposits, get excited about every time anyone talks about it. In fact, one of my memories of Edward Teller is Teller was the American advocate for a thorium fuel cycle. Edward used to drive you nuts, bore you to death talking about it. I remember sitting in Sicily in a physics seminar, which I was sort of the outlier, because believe me, if there's one thing I don't understand, it's string theory. And I'm well beyond the capability of ever thinking I could understand string theory. But Teller wanted to talk to me, talk my ear off about thorium and its advantage. Molten salt sodium, liquid sodium is not a new idea. It's an idea that's been around. It's not to say there may be ideas out there. I understand, I think, the advantages of small modular reactors. I remain somewhat skeptical about how they fit in an American grid situation and an American operating environment, because I was so burned, as most of us were, by the way we allowed utilities to have 1 or 2 nuclear reactors and expect that they would do it in the safest, most economical way, as opposed to the French. French, you do serial production of one design, you build nuclear islands, and you have a common operating company and an experience, and you do it damn efficiently and damn well. But it's not to close the door, and I understand there are other concepts that's around. To date, there is, and I have been educated today by Ron about the theory, the Bill Gates reactor design, and I promised myself that's one I haven't been called on, to look at it and figure it out. Now, I haven't left very much time for discussion. I'm here, Ron's getting nervous, so I apologize for going on. It's a topic that I wish I had a seminar of a year, or at least a semester, to examine all the intricacies.
Privilege it is to have been selected to give this lecture. I feel lucky to have considered Glenn both a friend and a colleague for over 25 years, and would like to sort of start out